If the Bible was simply about loving your neighbor, it wouldn't be the best-selling book of all time. Welcome to the Ryan Holmes podcast, where our goal is to encourage Christian thinking and Christian living. This week, we are bringing you episode 19. And as we get started, if you have been enjoying this podcast and you would like to help us grow a little bit, would you go over to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review? That'll just help boost its reach and visibility. That would be really, really helpful to us. So thank you for doing that. If you'd like to support the podcast even further financially and the work that I'm doing, would you visit ryanhomespodcast.locals.com and subscribe for just $5 a month. Our Locals community members get additional perks, so go and check that out at ryanhomespodcast.locals.com. Would you also go check out wretchredeemed.com to get some merch today? That's wretch, WRETCH, redeemed.com. So go over there and check that out as well. Sorry. If you prefer video format, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and also like the videos, comment, share them. That'll also help get this out to more people, and that would be great as well. If you have any questions from a previous episode or today's episode, you can send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com, ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. And I want to encourage you, within the next probably week or two, I'm going to have our very first Q&A episode. So I'm going to be answering your questions. And so I already have questions ready from some of you have sent in to me, which I really appreciate. So I encourage you, if you haven't sent one in yet, please do that. Send it to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com, or if you follow along on Instagram or Facebook, you can also message me there, and you will get your question answered on that episode, and we're looking forward to it. So I'm going to link to everything that I just kind of blew through real fast in the show notes, so you won't miss it, and you can check that out there. So thank you, and I do hope that you enjoy today's episode. Today we are addressing a statement that I have often heard about the Bible, and this statement is it can often come in many different kind of forms, but the statement is essentially this: the Bible is all about loving your neighbor. The Bible is all about loving your neighbor. Or some might say that it's all about caring for the poor and needy. I'm sure many of you you've probably heard some sort of formulation of this statement before. I want to address this reductive kind of statement or argument about the Bible. I think it's important to understand fully what's typically going on when someone says this about the Bible. I find that it's usually in the context of justifying a particular belief or justifying one's sin. Take, for example, the LGBT issue, for instance. People actually appeal to the Bible when it comes to this issue by claiming that the Bible is all about love. Well, is the Bible all about love? Is the Bible simply about loving your neighbor or caring for the poor and needy? Well, these are questions that I want to address today, kind of collectively, because really they're all coming from the same position. Now, with every successful deception, there is always a little bit of truth. Is the Bible all about love? Well, in some sense, yes. Collectively, the Bible spells out God's redemptive plan for all humanity. God is expressing his love to you and I through the scriptures. But when someone says that the Bible is all about love, there are some questions that should be addressed before we can affirm such a statement. These first two questions are actually questions that should be questions that you ask in your kind of everyday conversation, especially conversations about your faith. The first question is, what do you mean by that? The second question is, how did you come to that conclusion? We've addressed this early on in the podcast as well, but I think it's a good refresher or reminder to talk about these things and just consider them as applications in our own lives. These questions, they're not attacking the person in any way. They're just probing questions. They help clarify what the other person means by what they're saying. Asking the question, what do you mean by that, helps you understand what the person means when they say the Bible is all about love. Asking, how did you come to that conclusion, helps you understand whether this individual has actually looked through the things that they're talking about. I encourage you to begin using these questions, especially when people make comments about the Bible or Christianity. They are non-confrontational, and you don't have to know everything, let alone anything, to simply ask questions. Now, there are some other questions that come to mind about this idea, specifically about the Bible being all about love. The first question would be, whose definition of love are you using? Whose definition of love are you using? Are we using our own subjective definition of what love is? Or if we are appealing to the Bible, are we using a biblical definition of love? Because a biblical definition of love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth, as 1 Corinthians 13 tells us. Another question would be, what standard are you appealing to? I find it ironic that people are actually willing to appeal to the Bible to justify certain sinful behaviors. But if you are going to appeal to the Bible and give it credibility by doing so, you have to appeal to the standard God has given us in the Bible. Then you'd have to ask yourself, are the perspectives and actions I am trying to justify actually justifiable based on what the Bible has to say? In most cases, you're actually better off rejecting what the Bible has to say rather than appealing to it in order to justify sinful behaviors or beliefs. Now, is the Bible all about loving your neighbor? Well, it is true that we are to love our neighbor. It is true that we are to care for the poor and the needy, the widow and the orphan. As Christians throughout the centuries since Jesus have actually been engaging in loving their neighbors and caring for the poor and needy. These are all ways in which we display the love of Christ to our world. And we are called to do this as followers of Christ. But if the Bible was simply about loving your neighbor, it wouldn't be the best-selling book of all time. And there wouldn't be billions of Christians worldwide today. If you're going to reduce the Bible down to simply loving one's neighbor, then what would distinguish Christianity from any other religion? Or what would distinguish Christianity even from secular thought or secular writings that have the common sense notion that it is a good thing to be kind to your neighbor? You see, even non-believers intuitively know that it's good to be kind to other people, that it is a virtue to be kind and a vice to be evil. Almost every known religion that I can think of has at least something in their holy scriptures that talk about loving or being kind to other people. So is that really all that the Bible is about? The answer is clearly and obviously no. This kind of oversimplified thinking about the Bible tells me one thing. If you believe this, then you really don't know much about the Bible at all. It sounds harsh, but it's a harsh reality. If you honestly believe this about the Bible, you are making it abundantly clear to everyone that I don't actually know what's written in it. I know that people who do believe this might think that they have this kind of elevated knowledge about what the Bible has to say, but really they are just exposing their own ignorance. What the secular world says, love is far different than what God says love is. And if you are going to bring in the Bible at all, you need to be working within the confines of what God says love is. Let's give a brief understanding of what biblical love is. We referenced 1 Corinthians 13 earlier, and there we find a detailed definition of what love is. I'll read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1 through 3 first. It says this: "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing." The beginning of the chapter warns about not having this kind of love. It explains that it doesn't matter what we do in this world. If we don't have this love, it is all for naught. It was all wasted without this kind of love. Verses 4 through 7 then give a definition of what this love is. It says this: "Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." Now, I'm sure you've heard these verses probably at a wedding sometime, and I think for the most part we would all agree that with most of what is being said. I think it's a very good definition of what love is, and it's the proper definition because it comes from God. Of course, love is patient and kind. It isn't arrogant or rude. Of course, it bears all things and endures all things. That's what a true form of love is. But what people often tend to omit, whether purposefully or not, is that love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. Oftentimes, when you as a believer do speak truth, you're quickly labeled as hateful or a bigot. You're accused of being unloving. But here's the thing: if you are being patient, kind, and respectful while speaking truth to people, you are acting in the biblical sense of what love is. This is God's definition of love. Jesus said that there is no greater expression of love than what he said in John 15:13. He says this: "Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends." So love is all of these things that we mentioned, and it is also sacrificial. And Jesus himself embodied this kind of sacrificial love on the cross for you and for me. I'm sure most of us know what Romans 5:8 says, where the Bible tells us this: "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Jesus himself was bold with the truth. He told the truth and didn't pull any punches, all the while being extremely loving to those he came in contact with. And he paid the ultimate price of giving up his life for all of mankind. So, the question remains: are you appealing to this kind of love? Or are you appealing to a love that does not rejoice in wrongdoing, that does not rejoice in sin, but rather in righteousness and truth? If you are appealing to the Bible, then that is the standard of love that you're appealing to. Now, in order to understand that the Bible cannot be reduced down to loving one's neighbor, you just have to read it. Again, if someone believes the Bible is simply about loving your neighbor, this is proof that they really haven't read it. We don't need to go through the entire Bible to show this. We can just take a few examples. Let's consider Genesis for a minute. Genesis is a historical narrative. It is a book that is majority descriptive. It's describing historical events. It wouldn't be considered a book that is prescriptive. Within the book of Genesis, we have the creation, we have the fall, the flood. It lays out the beginning of the human race. It lays out the beginning of the Hebrew race. We read of the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Genesis really helps us understand the foundational events and the foundational people God has used to bring about his redemptive plan for all of mankind. So, based on just this limited bit of knowledge that I've just given you, can we say that Genesis is all about or entirely about loving your neighbor? Well, we don't get much that's actually prescriptive for you and me, because again, it's a historical narrative. Let's consider another book here for a minute, the book of Proverbs. Unlike Genesis, Proverbs is not a historical narrative, but rather it is essentially a letter written from a father to his son. Solomon is exhorting his son with precepts of wisdom. It is wisdom and instruction written to a young man or young person. Almost a life manual, if you will, from an older, wiser man who has lived through some things, and he's failed through some things as well. Can we say the book of Proverbs is all about loving your neighbor? Well, it does provide a lot of prescriptive instruction, but it definitely could not be boiled down to loving one's neighbor only. You would have to be ignoring a whole lot to believe such a thing. Why don't we look at the Gospels for a minute? Like Genesis, the Gospels are historical narratives, but the Gospels are specifically eyewitness testimonies of the events that took place. Now, in the Gospels, this is where we see this prescriptive command to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I'll read it for you just quickly. Matthew chapter 22 and verses 37 through 40. This is Jesus speaking. He says this, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." So there's certainly a heavy emphasis placed on loving your neighbor, and I absolutely agree that this should be a regular practice of a genuine believer, as well as loving God with all of your heart, soul, and mind. We are to love God first and allow the relationship of ourselves to Him to impact our relationships to other human beings. The question, though, remains, is loving our neighbor the only thing communicated in the Gospels? The Gospels ultimately tell the historical accounts of the life of Jesus, where he was born, where he went, the things he did, the miracles he performed, and culminating in his death, burial, and resurrection. There's so much to the Gospels. It's important to note as well the purpose for Jesus' death and subsequent resurrection. In fact, loving our neighbors doesn't actually make sense apart from this purpose. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21 says this, "For our sake he made him," that's Jesus, "to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Ephesians 5:2 says, "And walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18 says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit." Galatians 3:13 says this, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us." If there would be anything to highlight from Scripture, would it really be loving your neighbor above all of this? Again, loving your neighbor doesn't make much sense apart from what Jesus has already done for you and for me. Jesus' purpose was to die for you and I in order to take our sin upon himself in exchange for his righteousness and a right standing before God. This is what the Gospels talks about, something that is much deeper and far more robust than simply loving your neighbor. let's look at one more book. How about Revelation? Now, I know someone says the book of Revelation and everybody shudders. It's the book that no one likes to talk about, but they know we have to because it's in there. What is Revelation all about? Well, Revelation is a prophetical book. It looks at events to come in the future. It has the letter to the 7 churches, and then it goes on to talk about the events surrounding the end times and Jesus' return. Now, there are many, many different views on Revelation, but that is at least a brief kind of rundown. And I feel like the question has now become kind of rhetorical, but is Revelation all about loving your neighbor? No, obviously not. We really could go on and on breaking down every book of the Bible to show clearly that the Bible cannot simply be reduced down to loving your neighbor. I do hope that this has given you some kind of intellectual ammunition, though, in the case you might be in a scenario where someone might make this claim about the Bible. Remember, the best response is to ask questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And you don't need to have all the answers. Just simply ask a few questions. I do want to say, if you could reduce the Bible down to some kind of love, it certainly would not be our love for another person. If you reduced it down to love, it would undoubtedly be God's love for us. Because our love for our neighbor is simply a byproduct of God's love for us. It is the effect to the cause, and the cause being God's love for you and for me. We love him because he first loved us, as the Bible tells us. We wouldn't have the ability to love without his love for us first. We wouldn't even exist without his love for us first. The love that should be highlighted is not our love. Our love is weak. Our love is fickle. Our love can be put on and fake. We are sinful, broken, wicked people. And if it weren't for God's love, we would never fully know how to love our neighbor. It's God's love that deserves the highlight. It's God's love that deserves the recognition. I really hope that this has been somewhat clarifying for you. I've heard statements along these lines often. In almost every case, the intention behind the statement has been to justify some sinful behavior or justify a belief that a sinful behavior is morally okay. Rarely have I found a devout Christian who knows their Bible well making statements like this about the Bible. My hope was just to provide some clarity about this and hopefully prevent maybe just one person from being swept up in this kind of thought process. I want to encourage you, please continue loving people to the best of your ability, while at the same time not sacrificing truth in the process. We must understand that it is far more loving to tell someone the truth than it is to affirm them in their lie. We must speak the truth so the truth can set them free. It is not our job to change their heart. It is the Holy Spirit's. We simply just share the message of hope and truth. And that's the encouragement that I want to leave you with today. Well, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions for me, a thought or a comment, even maybe a topic you want me to discuss in a future episode, please send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. I'm also looking to do a lot more interviews this year. So if you have an idea of somebody that you want me to interview, then send me that in the email as well. I would be glad to look into it. Don't forget to visit ryanhomespodcast.locals.com to join our community. I appreciate any support. Check out wretchredeemed.com as well to get some merch. I'm going to be posting some brand new t-shirt designs hopefully in the next couple weeks, so be on the lookout for those. And if you're on the YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and ultimately please share this podcast, and let's encourage others to think about their faith and live it out. See you next week.